Motherhood takes on a lot of different forms. It reminds me of a man who was sitting in his living room watching TV, and he hears from the kitchen his wife, "My love, what would you like for dinner? Beef, veal, or chicken?" And he yells in, "Oh, that's wonderful, I'll have the chicken." And then he hears, "I was talking to the dog, you get soup." It's the closest thing I could find for mothers, okay? That was it. Of course, I did have 5 or 6 sheets, but I'm not going to do those. Probably when you looked at the bulletin, many of you went, why in the world would he cover widowhood on Mother's Day? Well, there's 2 reasons. One, God did it, not me. So that gets me totally off the hook, because as you know, we're going through 1 Timothy, and the way the schedule worked out, this Sunday talks about widows. So, hey. The other reason is that most widows, not all, but most widows have been mothers. And we're going to find in this passage that God even talks about being a mother. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5. We're going to be looking at verses 3 through 16. Now, what I want you to remember is that in Bible times, back then, there was no Social Security, there were no pensions, there was no life insurance. So when a woman lost her husband, things were tough. It was hard. Many of the widows became destitute, poor. Now, God did set up in the Old Testament the idea of what I'm going to call gleaning, which meant that a orphan, widow, the poor had the right to go into a field after the harvesters had gone through and gathered up whatever the grain happened to be. Whatever they missed, those people were allowed to take it. The owner could not have his harvesters go over the field a second time. They could not stop people from following them. Okay? So it was set up that way. But it was long, hard, back-breaking work. And that's all they had. When Jesus came to this earth, he elevated the position of women beyond anything that had ever been done before. And the church took it one step further. That when the church was established, you can read this in Acts chapter 6, they set up a system to help the widows, to be there for them. Because again, in the society in general, widows didn't stand a chance. It was a very difficult life. Now, if you read Acts chapter 6, you're going to see that even from the beginning there was troubles. Well, who's running it? Humans. So there's always going to be a few mistakes here and there. But it was a good system, a way of feeding and taking care of widows. Now, by the time Timothy comes around, we're talking between 20 to 30 years after the original church was established. There's much more organization. Things are much bigger. And once again, Timothy needs help from his mentor, Paul. Evidently, again, we don't know why Paul, besides the Holy Spirit, we don't know why Paul included this unless Timothy had sent him a letter and said, I need help. I'm having this difficulty. We're not sure. But Paul, in a few verses, gives Timothy some instruction. And from the sound of it, it was much needed instruction. So in 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16, I want you to consider that according to Paul, there were 5 categories of widows. 5 different groups, all widows, but fitting into different categories or compartments. I'm going to go through all 5 right away, and then we're going to go back and look at each one. The 5 categories are these. 1, those who were truly needy. We find this in verses 3 and 5. 2, those who desire to serve God, give themselves totally over to God, verses 9 and 10. 3, those having relatives who are able to support them, verses 4, 8, and 16. 4, those living in what the Bible calls wanton pleasure, verses 6 and 7. And 5, those who are young, verses 11 to 15. So, we can look at these 5 groups. Now, before you decide to put your mind at rest and figure, well, he's talking about widows, I don't really have to listen, there are actually lessons that we can learn that Paul wrote to Timothy concerning widows. So, stay with me. Group 1, those who were truly needy. In verse 3, Paul says to honor widows. Honor widows who are widows indeed. So Paul is referring to those who were truly needy. The word to honor means to respect and to give proper recognition, resulting in the help that they need. And so, Paul was basically saying, just because a woman says she is a widow, dig a little deeper. Check the life. And isn't that true with everything? How easy it is to say something and so hard to live it. There's a lot of people out there who would call themselves Christians. But if you look at their life, it's not true at all. And please don't quote to me, Skip, remember, judge not lest you be judged. Let me tell you, I am allowed to be a fruit inspector. Yeah, you were supposed to giggle at that. Timothy, you have widows who are truly in need, but make sure. The idea would be to give them the help that they need, and this includes care, financial support. Because according to verse 5, this widow is putting her trust in God. She knows that God is the husband to the widow. That God is the provider. And that He is the one whose hand she is in. And so her trust is, God is going to help me. I've lost my husband, but I still have God. and he's not going to let me go. Again, isn't that true for all of us? That the circumstances you and I go through, God is right there holding us in his hand. It's been said that God is a hedge of protection. Ahead, behind, sides, above, and below. And that no matter what we go through, God is there. Always will be, for those of us who belong to him. As I mentioned earlier, a widow was in dire straits. And so according to verse 5, they would put their trust in God. Timothy, there are those who are widows indeed. And we'll talk about their life in just a moment as we get to group number 2. These are those who desire to serve God, to give themselves totally in service and worship and their lives to God. We find this in verses 9 and 10. Yes, I realize we're jumping around, but that's how it's working. Let me actually read 9 and 10. Let a widow be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. Now, that list is not the list for help of the widow. According to the church, all widows who truly needed help would get it. This list is, let's call it an agreement or a contract that a widow who had lost her husband says, all right, I now promise, I now want to serve God fully. He is my all. I will do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. Paul says, don't put somebody on that list too fast. And look at what he says. He says, check their life. In other words, they were already doing it in the whole process of living their married life. Good works, raising children. Happy Mother's Day. See, I'm going to keep throwing that in so you don't forget. Just. And so Paul goes through all of these different aspects of a woman who has now pledged to serve God the rest of her life. In other words, she's basically giving back to the church. Her previous lifestyle is already showing her devotion. She has the proper attitude. Now, just the only one that really needs explaining, I mean, that's a lot of stuff there, but raising children we can understand, good deeds we can understand and accept. But then we get to the washing the saints' feet. It's like, are you kidding me? She had to go around and find dirty saints and wash their feet? No. This was more metaphorically speaking, a picture, if you will, of a woman who had a humble attitude. Because if you'll remember back What did Jesus do the night before his crucifixion? He washed the disciples' feet. The teacher humbled himself and did the job of a servant. They lived that example, a humble attitude. These widows would need help physically, but they also were going to be service. We'll hold off on the age for just a moment. I then want to go to group number 3, which is those who have relatives who are able to support them. Though it didn't always happen, the idea is that family members should take care of family members. Paul specifically talks about children and grandchildren because basically, I'm going to use the word we are indebted to those who first brought us into the world, second, brought us up, reared us, and third, loved us. Here's where we're getting into the mother idea. A woman who took care of her children until they became adults and had their own children. A woman who devoted her life to her family. And since she has a family, the family should take care of her. I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard somewhere that there's a group of people somewhere in the north that when a person gets too old to perform any duties in society, they put them on an ice block and push them out to sea. Don't know if it's true or not. I mean, there's weirder things that have been done in this world, but that's not God's idea. You take care of the elderly, even when they can't do anything. Because while you were growing up, they were doing something. Now, in verse 4, it gives us a positive statement. Look what it says at the very end. For this is acceptable in the sight of God. A positive statement. This is what makes God happy as families take care of each other, especially the ones who have been brought up take care of the elderly now. It's a positive statement. God is so pleased with this. But now let's jump down to verse 8, which also goes about a family taking care of their own family. Now we have the negative statement. Paul says, those who will not care for their families are worse than the unbeliever or the pagan. You see, God had set up the principle of compassionate Christian love. And for a family member not to help a family member, and he's writing to the church, by the way. We're not talking about those that do not know Christ as their Savior. We expect them to do that, not help. That's what we expect. Paul is saying that they are denying Christian love. And what is Christian love? It's remembering that Jesus Christ loved us unconditionally. And the Bible even says God demonstrated his love in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That was the extent of God's love for you and for me, for Christians. And so it would make sense that Christians should show their love through their actions. And then Paul says, and I need to read it because I don't remember, that was the part he has denied the faith, the compassionate Christian love, and then is worse than an unbeliever, or let's use the word pagan. Even most pagans will fulfill their duty. It's a duty. All right, I'll do it. They may not enjoy it, but they do it. And so what Paul is saying is that a believer who will not fulfill the duty, yet the believer knows what God has commanded and has the Holy Spirit living within inside him, which gives them the power to obey, they're worse than a pagan. Worse than an unbeliever. Does he say they are unbelievers? No, you know that. God puts up with a lot. But they're worse than that group of people. So the idea is widows that have families should not need the help of the church. Okay? First two groups need the help of the church. This third group should not need the help of the church. Group number 4, which is found in verses 6 and 7, is an interesting look. It says, after talking about the one who has given himself to God in verse 5, verse 6 says, but she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. The idea of wanton pleasure is riotous living or aggressive seeking after worldly satisfaction. Notice how I worded it. Aggressive seeking after worldly satisfaction. Now, this could be immoral action or ungodly action, but it could just mean living for self, putting God in second place. Did you hear that? Living for self. Isn't that something that any of us can fall into the trap of? This expression may have come somewhere else. I think I made it up because it's not that great, but I like it. It's pleasures do not need to be sinful to be sinful. Anything that is put ahead of God becomes sin. Now, I will refrain from meddling and will not give examples. I'll let you think about it. Is there anything that you have put on a higher level than God? Some pleasure. And I'm really not going to say any of mine, so we're all safe here. These women, this group of widows, were themselves. And what Paul says about them is they are alive physically, but spiritually, they're dead. This, again, does not mean they're not Christians. It doesn't mean they've lost their salvation. What it does mean is that they have broken that spiritual tie with Jesus. We call it the fellowship of the Spirit, fellowship with Jesus. Knowing that he's here, knowing that he's close. It's like a wall has been built. It's a separation, which is the actual definition of death. Separation. And so even though they're alive, spiritually, they're not with God anymore. They're not walking close to him. They're living for themselves. These widows should not be helped. They're not putting their trust in God. But let's back up just a little bit and realize that you and I can be in the same boat. Broken fellowship with God, ineffective service, going through the motions because something is more important. It's a very easy way back. If we confess our sins. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That's what the widow needed to do. That's what you and I can do if we find we're in the same boat. And then in verse 7, Paul says, now teach them, Timothy, exhort those people so that the erring individual can know and can change. A lot of times, we just don't know that we're in error. That's why we come together as a body. That's why we inspect fruit. So that together we can be stronger. And then the final group, group 5, the younger widows. Now, evidently, younger was anything less than 60. That might make some of us happy. I kind of think it should be younger than that, but evidently, according to Paul, if you're under 60, you're a younger widow. Don't answer, but I wonder how many women around 60 really want to start a family again? I don't know. Because that is what Paul says. Younger widows, don't put on the list. Don't let them make a pledge or a promise to serve God the rest of their lives. Don't let them do it. Remember what I said, the list was not for those who should get help. This list was a vow, a promise. Timothy, don't let them do it. Because younger widows may want to get married. Listen to what he actually says. But refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married. So what happens is, they make a promise, I will serve God totally the rest of my life. We have an example of that in the book of Luke chapter 3, Anna. She became a widow after only 7 years of marriage. And she lived at the church, praying, fasting, doing service, until she was 84. Well, I don't know how much longer she lived, but that's how old she was when she met baby Jesus. There's an exception. Most younger widows don't want to get married. They'll want to have children. And according to Paul, this is great, because in verse 14, I'll back up to 13 in a minute. In verse 14, one of the highest callings is to raise godly children and run the household well. Happy Mother's Day. Highest calling is to raise godly children. You can do no better than that. I know in the day and age we live in, many women go to work. Some have become CEOs of company. Some have become named something great. But in God's eyes, the highest calling is mother. Mom. Mommy. That's the highest. Paul says, younger widows, go for that. Otherwise, backing up to verse 13, you may live a lifestyle that is a very poor testimony. Being idle, being a gossip, saying things that shouldn't be said, a busybody. Don't let that happen. And we see that in verse 15, if a younger widow does not want to follow God's call, getting married again, having children, there is the danger of following the false teachers and spreading their lies, or there's the danger of marrying an unbeliever, both of which are part of Satan's plan to destroy a Christian's testimony. Follow Satan. And so Paul warns what should happen. And then finally in verse 16, it mentions for a woman to take care, that comes under relatives who take care of their own widows. But I want to just make it just that little bit broader in closing. The church is here to help those who are in need. As a body, we should care for each other. Even in a congregation our size, there's a lot of needs. Don't wait to be asked. Because many times we won't ask. Take the initiative to see what can be done and help to make our body, this congregation, this group of believers, strong. Yes, the advice was written for widows, or for Timothy in dealing with widows. But we can learn a few lessons from it. Father God, we are grateful for your word and how it does instruct. We know, Lord, that sometimes your instruction is not as easy to hear as other times. That's how you wrote it. Thank you for your wisdom that is total and complete, and that you know what we need when we need it. Father, as always, I thank you for those who have come out this morning. I ask your hand of blessing upon them. Father, I also know that there are needs here. Some are secret. I'm glad you know them. May you deal with them in a very supernatural way. May we see your hand very, very clearly, that it may be a testimony to your grace. to your love. Father, as we go back out into the world now, I ask that you might guide us, that you might show us where we best can help others. May you protect us. May you bring us back. For all that you do, we are grateful. We do love